Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Born in Scotland, Ben M. Freeman is a gay Jewish author and internationally renowned educator focusing on Jewish identity, combating anti-Semitism, and raising awareness of the Holocaust. His first book, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People, was released in February 2021, and today we are discussing his second book, Reclaiming Our Story, The Pursuit of Jewish Pride. Currently based in London, Ben now heads up the humanities team at an American international school and lectures on anti-Semitism at Hong Kong universities. Through his work, he aims to educate, inspire, and empower both Jewish and non-Jewish people from all over the world. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you so much for having me.
Nice to have you.
Such a pleasure to be here.
I just want to start with how you describe your book on one foot. Like, how do you tell people why they need another book about anti-Semitism?
So I would say my books are not just books about anti-Semitism. You're actually absolutely right. There are many, many brilliant books about Jew hatred, analysing it, describing it. My books focus on the impact of Jew hatred on Jews. So it's a completely different perspective, and it's really one that most people are not addressing. They look at it analytically. And of course I offer analysis and I describe it in the first and second book, but my main kind of area of interest is how this impacts us. How do we experience the world as Jews who are also experiencing Jew hatred?
And you say we've internalized Jew hatred. What does that mean? How would you actually break that down?
So I would say that many Jews do, and all Jews have the capacity. So this is not something that impacts every single Jew, rather many Jewish people. And I would say that internalized anti-Jewishness is when Jews allow the wider world to define our identity and our narrative, and we basically absorb their perceptions of us into ourselves. And that really manifests across the board, or more generally speaking, as Jews wanting to be good Jews, wanting to be palatable Jews, but it does have other, perhaps more extreme examples as well.
And when you say be good Jews, palatable Jews, kind of not make a fuss, not complain too much, not keep crying anti-Semitism, not necessarily speak out on this topic or the other, is there a sense of kind of like just get on with it and don't ruffle feathers? That
is absolutely one of the manifestations of diminishment. That is that type of an internalized anti-Jewishness that I describe in this book. And it's the hangover of the keep your head down policy. Keep your head down, don't say anything, just get on with it. Even last week, with this Kanye West crisis, we saw people saying, don't complain, we're making it worse. And I think that's really the question, can we make it worse? I define Jew hatred as a non-Jewish problem. It's a non-Jewish problem that impacts Jewish people, of course, but just like homophobia is not a gay problem, it's a problem of the wider world, it's similarly with us. So we have to understand, okay, can we have an impact in that way? And I'd say no, Jews talking about Jew hatred does not cause Jew hatred. And what's more, it's a way for us, as the book's title suggests, to reclaim our story and our dignity. We fight back because we know we deserve better.
In a way, though, and Yair Rosenberg talked about this, there's this kind of catch-22 where if Jews do speak out, if Adidas fires him and CAA fires him, suddenly it sort of proves the point that Jews run the world, right? That there's somehow levers that get activated because Jews are so organized and powerful.
People certainly believe that, but I still think we should not be defining or basing our kind of action in terms of how we fight back against the hatred we experience on, are we going to make it worse? Is this going to prove to them that they're right? They're going to hate us anyway. We're hated if we're loud, we're hated if we're quiet, we're hated if we stand up, if we don't, if we're capitalist, if we're communist. That's our reality. And that's why we have to understand how this impacts us. I think that many Jews around the world were quite stunned and shocked by what Kanye was saying, and the reaction, and the fact that it took 2 weeks for Adidas to say anything. That is quite a shocking state of affairs, and I think what we have to do is wake up. And that awakening is not to make us scared. It's not to make us cower. It's not even to make us leave the countries in which we live. If we want to live in Britain, America, if we want to live in the diaspora, then we should. But we have to do so with open eyes. We have to do so with an understanding of Jew hatred and how we are perceived and how we have to be strong. We have to be proud because the world wants us not to be. They want us to be quiet.
What does it mean to be strong and to be proud? When you see the banner that got unfurled over the 405 in California, Kanye was right about the Jews, and you see someone actually doing the Heil Hitler sign. I mean, you almost can't believe what your eyes. And so part of, I think, my reaction is, a little bit of the futility of all of this, but also my choice is in a way not to honor it or dignify it by giving it more breadth and more airtime, if that makes sense. But maybe that's a mistake.
No, I think there's many different responses, and there's many different responses rooted in pride. Jews are not a monolith, right? We're individual people who make up this greater community, and each of us will have different reactions. I think there's two different types of pride. The first is personal, let's call it private pride, that even if you choose not to wear a Magen David,
like you do.
Like I choose to wear Magen David, but even if you choose not to because you think it might not be safe, that doesn't mean you're not proud. It means that you're understanding the state of the world. You can still love your Jewishness, you can still be deeply proud, reject non-Jewish definitions of our experience and identity, but still want to preserve your physical safety. So it's absolutely okay to say, I'm not going to give this airtime because I know they're wrong. I know that we deserve better, and I'm going to feel it inside myself. But then there's also another type of pride, which is public pride, right? It's a way to kind of raise our voices, to wear our kippot, to wear our Magen David, to be outwardly Jewish, openly Jewish. And that is really great and wonderful, but it might not be for everyone. And I would never, people always ask me, they say, Ben, should I wear kippah? Should I wear Magen David? And I say, you have to choose, because you have to kind of understand the circumstances in which you live and say, is it safe? There have certainly been areas that I've lived where it is less safe to wear outward symbols of Jewishness, and I will consider whether I wear them, and that doesn't make me less proud. The most important thing for us to understand during these times of crisis is they are wrong. We've done nothing to deserve this. These lies about us, and let's call them what they are, they're lies. They are dehumanizing, and we reject them. We understand our humanity. We understand that we belong to a brilliant, beautiful, diverse, rich civilization that we should respect and celebrate. And the things that people say about us, the ways that we are framed, they're wrong.
One of the ways things are framed is as the white oppressor, particularly
yes,
recently
absolutely.
through a racial lens. How do you respond to those accusations and the sense that also Jews, because many are in a position of privilege, don't have a right to claim victimhood?
So I think there's two ways we have to look at this. One is the conversation on what is whiteness. I'll be very upfront and honest. In the census form, I don't tick white. I tick other and write Jewish. And the reason for that is that I do not feel that the white experience relates to my experience as a Jew. I understand, of course, that if I remove my symbols of Jewishness, my Magen David, my kippah, that I can be perceived as white as I walk down the street. And that's real, and that's important to recognize nuance. But that is not the whole story. And my experience, my identity as a Jew, is not defined via the experience and identity of another group. Their experience is real, the black community's experience is real and it's important. But my experience as a Jew is real and it's important. So I say that number one. And then with regards to what is...
I just want to stop you for a minute. I can imagine people responding and saying, how are you saying it's a nuance that you're a white man in America, for instance, or in England, where there are just differences that in terms of how white people are treated and black people are treated, people of color are treated. I mean, those are objective truths, not all the time, but the history of persecution because of how one looks is a real and a very different factor, right? I mean, I'm not denying Jewish persecution, but when you look at today, I just don't want to minimize.
No, it's not about minimizing, and this is the problem. Their experience is real and it's theirs. And my experience is real and it's mine. We do not reduce, we do not diminish 2,000 years of Jew hatred, which is very much still alive, by looking to the experience of another. We respect an experience, we want to understand it, and we acknowledge how we interact with it. As I did, I said, I understand there is nuance, but I'm here to tell American audiences, the world is not split into black and white. That is a false dichotomy. It's not the truth. It's not objective. There are many different factors at play. There are many different communities that do not fit into these boxes that particularly the United States is trying to put us into, and particularly with the Jews, it's a square peg in a round hole. And I think actually by identifying nuance is really important, and it's recognizing the wide variety of experiences. And I think it's actually generous for a Jew to want to consider other people's experiences when talking about their own. But I refuse point blank to define my experience via the experience of another. There are different ways to be persecuted. There's different ways to be oppressed. And yes, if I take my kippah and my Magen David off, people may not know I'm Jewish. But that is not the only form of persecution that Jews face. There is intergenerational trauma. There's other things that we experience. They're just as real. And the problem is that we are told they're not just as real. They say there is a hierarchy of oppression. There is not a hierarchy of oppression. I would say that factually speaking, historically speaking, The Jews are the most continuously persecuted minority group in the history of mankind, but that does not make our experience more important than others. Every experience matters, and we should be discussing every experience. I'm a Jew, so I'm going to discuss my own, but I want to understand others. I want to understand the similarities, I want to understand the differences, but I refuse very strongly to be defined via the experience of another, particularly if I'm showing nuance and understanding the complexity. But Jews have our own experience, and you could say the same about the Jewish experience versus the non-Jewish experience. Jews are treated one way in the world, and non-Jews are treated another. And non-Jewish is a big group. There's lots of people that fall into that. And I believe that just as there is advantage based on skin colour, based on gender, based on sexual orientation, there's also advantage and disadvantage based on Jewishness and not Jewishness. In the wider world, in the wider world, it is a disadvantage to be a Jew. And that impacts the way we live our lives.
I think people would argue with that at some point when you look at the success of Jews.
But it's more complicated than just financial. And it's also
it's not just financial, it's culture.
But it's a snapshot.
Science.
But it's a snapshot. We're looking at a period really from 1960 to the 2000s. That is this kind of referred to this golden age of American Jewry. That is a tiny percentage, a tiny portion of our wider history, and it's one that seems like it's coming to an end. Other groups are also successful. Other groups thrive culturally while still being oppressed. And that actually is the Jewish experience. I'm not saying we're oppressed here, but we have been able to thrive culturally while experiencing kind of immense persecution, and we cannot say, well, this happened, so this, therefore this doesn't.
Your lens on the LGBTQ history and the use of the word pride, that seems to be operating here when you say we need a Jewish pride movement.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. I'm also a proud gay man, and like many LGBTQ plus people of my generation, so I'm 35, we had to deal with immense amounts of internalized homophobia. We had to really discover pride. And people have to understand about the LGBTQ plus community that we're not, while I believe I was born a gay man, I was not born into the LGBTQ plus community. I was born surrounded by straight people. And this is important because it's a difference in my experience. So just as I should be understanding the black experience, other experiences other than my own, I would like the Jewish community to understand my experience also as a gay man. And I had to go on a path to pride. I had to really discover it. I had to do the work. And that is the context in which I write these books. So it's not just me thinking, theory or understanding history or research, it's also rooted in my lived experience. And I will say that the Jewish community is generations behind other communities. The black community is much further ahead than us in this issue, the LGBTQ plus community.
And what issue, the pride issue?
The pride issue, and also the issue of an understanding internalized hate. So in the black community, there are academics that understand internalized anti-black racism is one of the main manifestations of anti-black racism. Similarly, in the LGBTQ plus community, it's kind of an ongoing conversation about internalized homophobia. This is one of the first books in 100 years on this subject. There's of course articles, academic articles, but in terms of work created, books created, there aren't very many. And then people say that this phenomenon is rare. People say that it's a myth. Internalized anti-Jewishness is what I'm referring to. That's simply untrue. That means that these people do not understand the human experience. Because while internalized anti-Jewishness is kind of our version of it, this applies to many different communities. It is part of the human experience.
Can you talk about the 3 Ds? You had mentioned diminishment already. The others, as you list them, are denial and deployment. Can you explain?
So I will say there are other 3 Ds, and they were created by Natan Sharansky, so I really don't call mine the 3 Ds, even though they are 3 Ds, because I want to tip my hat to Mr. Sharansky. Yeah. But I have created, or I've identified rather, let's say, 3 main manifestations of internalized anti-Jewishness. Number 1 is diminishment, and that's what we spoke about earlier, keeping our heads down, making ourselves smaller, wanting to be good Jews, wanting to be palatable Jews, not making a fuss, changing our names, altering ourselves, making ourselves smaller. And that applies to many of us, and it was my experience. So I want to say very clearly, this is not me standing on a pedestal telling people off. This was my experience.
Right. You were doing that.
I was doing that. The next is denial, and that is when one denies their Jewishness. It was very common in pre-Enlightenment societies because Jews...
When you say Enlightenment, give people the years generally.
So the Enlightenment was the end of the 18th, beginning, and then throughout the 19th century. It was really the process that swept Europe and America about introducing thought, critical thought, and kind of moving away from these kind of more religious societies. The French Revolution is a big example. And denial was very common because you could convert to another religion. But those Jews who converted to other religions, other communities, they were still persecuted as Jews. They still had to prove themselves that they were good Christians. And then we have deployment. And this is when one deploys their Jewishness as a weapon. So often in our context, that is anti-Zionist Jews who would say things like, I'm Jewish, but. No, sorry, they wouldn't actually say that. That's things that I said. They would say, as a Jew, I believe that so-and-so is not anti-Jewish. We saw it in the UK all the time. We saw it with the Jews who were addressing Jeremy Corbyn. They'd say, as a Jew, Jeremy Corbyn doesn't hate Jews. Jeremy Corbyn did hate Jews. He did.
For those who don't remember the Jeremy Corbyn kind of chapter of all of this, because I know it informs a lot of your work.
Absolutely.
Can you encapsulate?
So Jeremy Corbyn was a Labour politician who was very hard left. And the thing to understand is that British politics is much farther left than the American politics. Like our Conservative Party is probably closer to your Democratic Party. So the Labour Party can be very left and Marxist. And Corbyn was a Marxist. And he came to a certain amount of power. He became leader of the Labour Party in 2015. And then for 5 years, he was leader of this party. And in that time, the Labour Party and Corbyn and his acolytes attacked Jewish people. They trolled us. They targeted us. His supporters tried to get me fired from my job in Hong Kong. They wrote to my school in Hong Kong. And at the Labour Party conference in
Why were they even paying attention to you?
Because I was on Twitter. I was fighting Corbyn. That's really where I came to prominence, because I've been doing Holocaust education and other Jewish work kind of in a smaller, non-public sense for a long time. At the 2018 Labour Party conference, they handed out Palestinian flags and they all waved Palestinian flags, and it was trolling. They were trolling us because they were saying, look, we can. And ultimately they lost the election. They lost the last general election in Britain, which was 2019. But 10 million British people voted for Corbyn, even though his Jew hatred was a very public conversation. So those Jews who supported him would definitely be Jews who would deploy their Jewishness as a weapon, but also anti-Zionist Jews. Eric Zemmour from France is a right-wing example, because while my work does focus on the left, this is not just a leftist problem. This is a problem in all parts of the political spectrum. I focus on the left because of my experiences and because Corbyn was, he manifested and he expressed left-wing Jew hatred.
So you obviously look at America and where the diaspora Jews are in terms of Zionism, in terms of the Israel conversation. And I don't want to say it's at its height, because it seems to be gaining temperature by the day. And we'll leave the elections for now, but they may not help.
No.
There is disquiet, particularly on campuses, about how Israel is functioning, Israel's policies, and its identity as a democratic state. How do you respond to those who have genuine, real angst or anxiety about what Israel has become and the fact that there is a large population that is suffering there? Whatever your political views, there is sort of a Jewish teaching of feeling responsible to the neighbor, and here you have neighbors who are living often in squalor and under great duress. So how do you, again, address those, particularly in their 20s, who say, I can't be proud of a country that stands by?
So I think we have to separate this. The first is we have to understand what Zionism is, right? I think it's really important to understand why that land. Why do the Jews have a right to be in that land? And Zionism is the movement of self-determination to return the Jews to their indigenous land. I'm Scottish. In Scotland, we never stop talking about independence. There's probably going to be another independence vote next year. No one responds to Scottish independence in the way they do to Zionism. So Zionism is what I just described, and that is a Jewish concept created by Jews for Jews, and also rooted in thousands of years of Jewish history. When Jews were sitting on the banks of the rivers of Babylon and they were saying or singing, by the rivers of Babylon there we wept when we remembered Zion, that is an expression of Zionism. It was a yearning to return home. L'shana haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, is a yearning to return home. So it's a very, very core Jewish concept. Now we have to understand that Zionism as a concept has been stolen from us. It was warped very purposely by the Soviet Union, who reframed it into something else, into imperialism, colonialism, to fit the kind of leftist, the post-war leftist ideology that focused on identity, that focused on decolonization. So this was a purposeful reframing. I want to say very clearly though, you can criticize Israel. Nobody says the opposite. Nobody should say the opposite. You can criticize Israel in the way you would criticize any other country. It's important to. No country is above reproach, particularly countries that are locked in long-running conflicts. We have to watch closely. We have to make sure that everyone is acting in the way that they should in very difficult circumstances, and we should criticize where criticism is due. Now, we have to also understand there is a much wider context to this.
Which is the delegitimization of the entire project.
The delegitimization of the entire project, which is itself rooted in 2,000 years of Jew hatred. So if somebody wants to criticize Israel, feels compelled, feels that they disagree with Israeli policy, go ahead. But you have to go through a little checklist in your head. You have to make sure that what you're saying is not informed by Jew hatred. And some people say, well, you know, that's not my intention. It's not always about intention. These are ideas that float around us in society. We're socialized perhaps without even realizing it. So we have to go through the real 3D test, Natan Sharansky's 3D test, which was ask yourself, does a statement, does an image, whatever it might be, demonize, delegitimize, and treat Israel with double standards? And we have to be introspective. You know, we're asking people around the world to do work. Do work to think about your own bias. Have some introspection about your own feelings about this. And people who feel emotionally angry and you know, virulently aggressive about Israel, I would really encourage them to ask why. Why Israel and not other countries? And that's again not to say that Israel's beyond reproach.
But why not Venezuela? Why not China? Venezuela? Why not Turkey?
Why not Britain or America? I mean, it does strike me as a little rich for British people and American people to be talking about Israel as a colonial entity when America exists on stolen land and Britain is rich because it stole other land. I mean, let's be very clear here. And I like Britain and I love America. Really, that's not here. I'm not here to demonize these countries, but we have to be honest.
So how do you explain that? How do you explain why there, if you believe that there is disproportionate
Jew hatred? It's Jew hatred. Jew hatred is in the foundations of the Western world. It's not some kind of little minor ideology. The Western world was created through Christian ideology, right? That was the dominant religion, the dominant ideology in the Western world. And Christianity itself was defined against Jews. And actually, I kind of understand it, to be honest, because the early Christians were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. So when they split off from Jews, they really had to explain why, right? Of course they do. It's a branding exercise. So then they had to say,
they had to make that separation.
They had to define their identity. And that started a trend of non-Jewish people defining their identities against us, understanding the world against us. So the Christians said, we're not going to keep kosher, the Jews do that. We're not going to circumcise, the Jews do that. And then this then developed into ideas that they define their identities against Jews. And then something very important happened. The Roman Empire converted to Christianity. And we have to ask ourselves, who killed Jesus? It was the Romans. The Romans killed Jesus. But they then, about 350 years after they murdered Jesus, they were then celebrating him as their Lord and Saviour. So they had to find another perpetrator, and that perpetrator was the Jews. So you have this idea.
This is not your narrative. This is you as a historian.
Yeah, this is historically, in my perspective, it's historically supported, absolutely. That's where the idea that the Jews killed Jesus came from. I'm sure many people watching this have heard that accusation before. Many Christians are very, very familiar with it. And that started this idea that Jews are this kind of ultimate evil who could kill someone as pure and good as Jesus. And what's more, we have this identity forming against us. So when we think about Israel, when we think about the world today, we cannot remove ourselves from that context. The world in which we live was built from what happened before. The ideas that were formed before, they inform us. So if you want to criticize Israel, you have to do the work to make sure that you understand Jew hatred. You are making sure that you're not inadvertently sliding into it. And I want to say inadvertently. Not everyone who criticizes Israel in even an anti-Jewish way is intending to. And the reason is these ideas are all around us. And people are not very well educated on Jew hatred, I would say.
So I want to finish with the 4 libels because they cover a lot of ground, and in some ways they're the mirror you want us to hold up to ourselves in terms of what we're internalizing.
Yes.
So can you just take us through them?
Sure. The first libel is economic libel, and that is really the idea that Jews are obsessed with money. And this idea comes from the fact that Judas, or it was pushed along by the fact that Judas apparently sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. And it was this idea that Jews will do anything for a buck. The communists said it, the Nazis said money is the god of Jews, and it was not helped by Jews being funneled into jobs that dealt with financial services. And none of these are innocuous. We can look at some of these libels like, oh, they're just saying Jews are rich, they're just saying Jews are wealthy, what's the big deal? It is part of this framing us as the kind of dangerous white majority today, and in other times it's had different expressions, but it's always that idea that Jews are dangerous, Jews are out to get us, Jews are exploiting us. Because it's not just that Jews are rich, it's that Jews are wealthy because we exploit, because we persecute others.
At the expense expense of?
At the expense of the wider world. So economic libel. Second libel is blood libel. And this did not originate with the accusation that the Jews killed Jesus. It was written about by Greco-Roman writers, but it certainly was pushed along. And it was the idea that Jews are bloodthirsty and Jews purposefully kill often Christian children to steal their blood, use their blood in our rituals. And it was rooted in this idea to make matzah, drink, Kiddush wine, whatever. And
as fantastical, as horrific, but fantastical as this is, why did this even gain traction? I mean,
because none of this is rational. None of this is rational. It's emotional. It's people wanting to understand the world, people wanting to make sense of things that are going on, people wanting to understand their place in the world. And this was as you say, it took traction. It was a very, very popular idea all across the world. I mean, it really was in Europe, but also in North Africa, also in the Middle East. And it still exists today. And the thing we have to understand about Jew hatred, the thing we have to understand about the libels is they're expressed in a way which fits the zeitgeist. So 2,000 years ago it may have looked one way, and today it might look another, but the core idea is the same. The next libel, I'll get through them very quickly, is conspiracy fantasy. And it's just the idea that we are conspiring to control the world, very simply. We saw it with COVID, we saw it with the idea that the Rothschild-Soros conspiracies.
Even World Trade Center, 9/11.
Absolutely, of course. And then the last one is the racial libel. And this is very important because this is another misunderstanding that I think many people have about the Jewish experience. Jew hatred is racism. And the reason is because we are racialized. So racializing is a verb. It's something that's done to us. It doesn't mean that we're a race. It means that we are racialized. And the racial libel racializes Jews. It talks about our genetics. It talks about our ancestry. And then it also talks about the way we look. It talks about the fact that our bodies look a certain way. Perhaps they think our faces look a certain way. The fact that we may have horns according to them. Those are the four libels, and we have to reject those ideas.
So I want to end with a quote from your website, Ben. You say, despite what the non-Jewish world tells us, we have a choice. We can reject who we are, or we can reject the non-Jewish world's idea of who we are.
Jewish people, like every group, have a right to define our own experience and our own identity. We cannot look to others to define who we are, particularly when those people belong to societies often built against us. They're not necessarily knowledgeable about our experience. We have to define who we are. And that's what I said when I talked about my identity, whether I would say white or not. My identity as a Jew is defined by my experience as a Jew. We get to define it, and it's vitally important. We get to reclaim our story. We get to reclaim Zionism. We cannot allow it to be bastardized. We cannot allow it to be warped. It is a Jewish concept created by Jews for Jews. We get to define our identity and experience. And not only we get to, we must.
I'm just going to stop you for a minute, because as galvanizing as this is, I can imagine people hearing it as like us, we.
Yeah, we're allowed to do that. That's what the gay community did. We have to become comfortable centering ourselves. And again, I'll say it, and I'm being very honest now and very open and very clear. We're generations behind other communities. The black community feels very comfortable, as they should, in centering their experience. The LGBTQ plus community feels very comfortable centering their experience. I know that firsthand. I'm a gay man. We talk about gay pride.
What do you mean by centering your experience?
Talking about our experience, understanding it, forming movements which speak to our experience very specifically. The gay pride movement, the LGBTQ plus pride movement, who did that speak to? Who was that for? It was for...
No one would say the Jews have been quiet in our society.
Well, I think that we have tried to be palatable. We have been loud, and we have been successful in many ways, but we have tried to be, in my opinion, palatable Jews. So I want to ask, why are the gay people allowed a movement which centres them? Say us, us, us. Why are black people but not Jews? Because that's really what we're saying here. When you say it says us, us, us.
It makes me uncomfortable.
Why does it make you uncomfortable?
I'm asking the questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Ben Freeman. It's really worth getting these books. They will certainly start the kind of discussion we're having here, and I hope you will engage them with the people you care about. It's great to be with you for In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin, and I will see you next time.